Wonderful. Do we have people in? We do. Well, might as well start. I'm sure a couple of people will come in a little bit late. But hello, everybody. Welcome to part of our webinar series with the Abraham Path Initiative. I'm so excited to introduce you to one of our board members and one of our founders of the Abraham Path. Josh is the co-founder of the Harvard Global Negotiation Initiative, and he's also a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He's the director and creator of the Master of Science degree program in leadership and negotiation at Bay Path University, where he spends a lot of his time. He's also received his PhD from the International Institute for Conflict Analysis at George Mason. I'm really looking forward to Josh's talk as he discusses his new book, Getting Back to the Table: 5 Steps for Reviving Stalled Negotiations. What I love about this book are both the very practical steps, yet also the themes of resilience that come from this book. There are a lot of books about how to win negotiations, but this is a book about how to get yourself up off the ground and start anew when you're in a place where you're not feeling great about where you are. Um, the Abraham Path Initiative has been in this position from time and time again. The very nature of our work, we sometimes take 2 steps back and then 1 step forward. And Josh's book has helped me. One of the wonderful things I love, Josh, is in the last almost 2 years, I've been executive director. Josh has always been there to help me when I've hit the mat and helped me come off the ground and bring parties together and ultimately have successful negotiations. I can also attest with a 7-year-old that the very last chapter, which is a book of games, is an excellent opportunity to use on a road trip, an 8-hour road trip from here to Colorado. So I will stop right now and I'll introduce Josh. He's going to give us an overview of the book, and at the very end there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you so much, Josh, and welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you. When Chris asked me if I would be interested in sharing and talking about the book, I certainly said yes. And after I said yes, I thought, not only will I talk about this from a point of view of negotiation, but there was ample opportunity to talk about it in terms of the development of the path. I had the amazing fortune to work on this project since the very beginning. And so we're talking about the end of 2003, early 2004. So a little over 20 years. And as Chris mentioned, the history of the development and the progression of the path is littered with successes and a lot of failures along the way. And one of the things that we had to do repeatedly was when things didn't go the way we hoped or imagined, we had to step back and figure out what happened and what were we going to do next. It was very much an iterative process. While we had a bit of a strategy, I don't want folks to think that, we laid this all out perfectly, because that's just not how this works. Failure is part of the deal in life. I mean, anytime we try to do anything of any substance, of any challenge, it's very likely we're going to experience failure and setback. And the question, as Chris said, is what do you do with that? How do you try to manage that? And so part of the reason I'll tell you about why I wrote the book in a little bit. But part of the reason was because there was just not that much written on this subject, and I felt like it would really help people to to consider it and to have a bit of a framework to work from. So I wanted to begin with a story, actually, from the path. So um, when we began to develop this idea, one of the common refrains that we heard from people was, this is an interesting idea, but you can't go from Iraq or Turkey all the way down to Egypt or Saudi Arabia. You're not going to be able to follow this route in the way that you've talked about. There's too many constraints, there's too many problems. So nice idea, but forget it, basically. And we don't sort of walk away easily. And we thought, well, if that's true, then maybe what we really need to do is do a bit of a study tour where we begin to introduce the idea, where we meet potential partners and things along those lines. So that's exactly what we did. And in early 2006, we organized what we called the Harvard Study Tour. And we set up a group of meetings in Turkey, in Syria, in Jordan, in Palestine, Israel, etc. And we met with potential partners. That was the goal, was to introduce the idea and meet with potential partners. And I want to just talk about the experience in Turkey. Um, the area of the path is in a place called Şanlıurfa, which is about a 2-hour flight from Istanbul. It's really in the middle of the country, and it's very, very different than Istanbul or Ankara. And when we were organizing the meeting in Şanlıurfa, we had some consultants, some friends and colleagues that some of the organizers knew from the Istanbul area, and they were advising us. And they advised us to invite a cross-section of people. And so we did so. And I think in one sense, we didn't fully understand the unique dimensions of the differences between Istanbul and that area and Şanlıurfa, and they were great. Um, as a result, we ended up inviting some people that raised some eyebrows in the community, because the community in Şanlıurfa can be a bit conservative, and being in a place that is in the middle of the country, has a different feel. And, projects like this or others that come from outside the region are often viewed with skepticism. So anyways, we organized a meeting with prospective partners, and about 30 to 40 people came. And the meeting went relatively well because people were cordial and nice to us. But what we learned afterwards was that we had created some concerns and worries about the project. There were concerns about the name, which I'll talk about later, etc., and other things. And in many ways, after the study tour, when we got back, my colleague Arzu Yilmaz let me know that there were some real concerns that had been raised by this meeting. And we thought, okay, this is not how we wanted to get off. This is not how we wanted to start. So what do we do now? And Arzu is a wealth of knowledge, a really talented um, individual, especially for reading the situations. And she said, I think that we should go back to Şanlıurfa, me, you, and another colleague of ours, and we should meet with folks and talk to them and try to manage the concerns and fears that they had, and to essentially apologize for raising any questions and concerns about the project. And we did just that. And that began with an apology that there were things that we should have done differently, and that going forward, we really wanted to create a local committee that would work side by side with us to implement the development of the path. And after that, things went a little more smoothly. We still ran into problems, but that failure led us to a different way of approaching things, and also sending a message. And William played an important role in this a few months later. William Murray, my colleague that most of you know, played a really important role by telling people in that local committee, listen, if there's anything that we do or say that causes a concern, please let us know. And our goal is to demonstrate to you that what we are saying about the path is indeed what the path is all about. But we had to prove to people over time that that was the case. And so out of those failures and worries and concerns, we were able to work with different groups of people and individuals over the years, and to the point where we now have a thriving path in Turkey, and coming back to life after the earthquake and the civil war in Syria. So it was a really good lesson for me. It was clearly a failure and a setback that we had to manage. And it's one of those that I reflect on when I think about this whole idea of failure in our negotiations, because that's really what it was. So let me tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book. So 5 years ago, I wrote another book called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And a woman came up to me at a conference, and she said to me, listen, I saw your book and read it, and it was really great. It's, 25 cases, very practical and tangible. But why did you focus on successes? And I said, well, tell me more. And she said, because over the course of my career, I negotiate a lot, but for me, the places where I really learn are around our failures. And she said, "Would you ever consider writing a book about failure?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it, but let me think about it and give it some thought and look around and see what else is out there." And then I happened to have a conversation with one of my students. As Chris mentioned to you, I run a master's degree at a smaller university called Bay Path University, and she asked me what I was working on. And I said, "Well, I'm, beginning to write this book on failure in negotiation and how to deal with it." And she said, "Oh, thank goodness." And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And she said, "Well, I feel like all we read about in the program are these amazing successes, which are really great, and they're very inspiring, but it feels like if we don't succeed all the time, we're bad negotiators and maybe we shouldn't do this." And I said to her, "Look, if that's the message that you're getting, then we're doing you a disservice because negotiation in practice is riddled with failure. Anybody that does this on a regular basis realizes they don't always get where they want to go. Right? And so part of the goal here was to recognize that setbacks and failures are indeed a part of the negotiation landscape and to create awareness about the different ways in which you can fail in negotiation. I've identified 7 of them in the book, and that's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's a start. And I think and part of the reason I did it that way was to actually help people to sort of notice that these are the ways that you can fail and to hopefully avoid those um, problems in the future. But I also wrote it to kind of broaden and deepen the conversation about failure in the realm of negotiation. And honestly, a number of people I've done when you put out a book, you do a lot of interviews on podcasts and other kinds of things. And I've had a couple of different people say to me, I know you were talking about negotiation, but in many ways, it seems to me like the kind of advice that you're giving people and that you're advocating is really about failure in general. And I could see that as part of all this, and you can certainly make up your own mind. Um, but the last reason that I wanted to do this was to help people really learn from their failures and setbacks. As I began to research this book and look into it, I realized that that always doesn't happen because failures and setbacks can be really challenging. So, what I found as I started to do this work was that there were 3 typical responses to failure in the realm of negotiation, and perhaps in other realms. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But then the analogy that I like to use was Goldilocks and the 3 bears. And I'm guessing that folks are familiar with that. But basically, if you're not, Goldilocks finds herself lost in the woods and stumbles upon a cottage. And there are 3 bowls of porridge in the cottage owned by these bears. And one of the bowls of porridge is too hot, one is too cold, and one is just right. And that analogy I felt like fit really well with how I was seeing people deal with failure in negotiation. The first one, the too hot response, is when we rationalize our behavior or we blame others. So we don't take any responsibility. We simply say that, I did this because the other person was unreasonable, because of the situation I found myself in. Bottom line is you don't really learn from your own rationalizations, and you certainly don't learn when you blame other people for when things didn't go well. Okay. So that's one response. Another response is what I would call a too cold response, right? And it's anxiety that the failure that I experienced was so debilitating, so difficult, so heart-wrenching that now when I go into future negotiations, I remember that vividly and I experience anxiety and I either don't want to negotiate or it dramatically impacts how I approach things. Again, you don't learn a lot that way. The third approach to or response to dealing with failure is what I would call the just right approach, or that we genuinely learn from what happened. And that requires introspection, it requires analysis, it requires us thinking about what happened and why and what we could have potentially done differently so that we become better negotiators. And as Chris mentioned, we become resilient. I've had the pleasure of working with lots of different negotiators over the years through Harvard and other places. And one of the things that I can tell you, one of the hallmarks of effective negotiators is resiliency and persistence. They do not quit. They do not give up. They say there has to be a solution. We just haven't found it yet. And that is the mindset that I'm wanting to try to instill in folks when they experience this. So let me tell you about a few of the different kinds of failures that you can experience and their magnitude. I don't have time to tell you all seven, but I'm sure if you go online or if you happen to be interested in getting the book, you'll be able to read through these. Um, but as I said, part of the reason that I did this was because I wanted people to be able to try to notice and look for those potential pitfalls before they fall into them, so that they, don't experience these failures. But a lot of times in hindsight, people will look back and say, yes, this is the kind of failure I experienced. Now, I've given them names so that they're a little bit easier to remember. This was a suggestion from a CEO who read the manuscript and said, I love these, but I'm having a hard time remembering them. So can you give them some catchy names? So I tried. So you can decide if they're catchy or not, but they sort of work for me. So the first kind of failure that I'm just going to share briefly is what I call slipping through the fingers failure. So this kind of failure is where it looks like all the sides that are involved in the negotiation have ample reason to reach agreement. Um, and it's in their interest and things along those lines. And yet somehow it falls through the cracks. It slips through their fingers when it shouldn't have. Um, I think we've all sort of experienced this where some dynamic, maybe it's ego or something like that, gets in the way of a what otherwise should be an agreement that makes sense for both sides. So, again, that's that first idea that in general, people, when they look at a situation, they say, this would very likely make sense for me, but somehow something happens and we don't reach agreement because there's a dynamic and a factor involved that we miss or that clouds our thinking. The second kind of failure is the what were you thinking failure, where we agree to something that is not in our interest to do. Now, a lot of times people agree in this way because it's expedient or because they believe that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement. And so they think any agreement is a good one. And part of one of the messages I want to get through is that's not how you should be thinking about negotiation. The way you should be thinking about negotiation is that negotiation is all about meeting your goals and objectives. And if you can't do that through an agreement, if an agreement doesn't meet your interest, you shouldn't agree to it. And there are lots of examples where people agree to something that doesn't meet their interest because they think negotiation is about reaching agreement, and they walk out and kind of kick themselves and realize that that agreement that they just signed didn't really actually meet their goals and objectives. Happens a lot. Again, as I said, it really happens because people tend to think that the purpose of negotiation is reaching agreement, and it's really not. The last one I want to share with you is this one called penny wise and pound foolish failure. So, what that really means is that we make a short-term decision at the expense of the longer term. And as a result, we end up having failures. Um, if you end up negotiating and you have to negotiate with the same people or the same company or organization over and over again, um, taking a short-term gain that might be suspect, that might damage the relationship, for example, is a pound foolish approach because you're going to need those people in the future. And eventually, people will figure out that what happened was that they got taken advantage of or something along those lines, and they're not going to want to negotiate with you. So you have to be very careful when you're, again, negotiating with the same people or companies or organizations of still meeting your short-term goals, but not at the expense of the long-term relationship. Okay. So those are a couple to think about. And like I said, there's others, and you can feel free to ask about them if you'd like. Now, I just want to mention really briefly, why is it that we don't typically learn from our failures? And this is something that I found to be very interesting as I talked to people in the field and I did research and did some surveys and things like that. Um, and it came down to really three categories of things, one of which we've already talked about, which is blaming and rationalizing your behavior and blaming the other, right? But the second one is a hidden one, and it's really about biases. That there are a lot of biases, psychological biases that impact our way of thinking. And the interesting part of this is that these biases are often unknown to us, and we are unaware that they are impacting our way of thinking. So a self-serving bias, for example, might be that I tend to think that whatever I do, um, I can justify, and I did it because of the kinds of situations I was in or something along those lines. But if the other person takes a similar action, it's because of the kind of person they are, right? Or the backfire effect is when I'm taking a position, if you start to push back against that position, instead of me really listening to your critique, I would double down even more and my views would become hardened as a result. And the other one is that we have a tendency as human beings, as Kahneman and Tversky, some Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist, informed us toward loss aversion. Human beings were wired to avoid loss, right? And this goes back to our hunter-gatherer days where if we lost, we got eaten, right? Not a very attractive proposition, right? And so we tend to focus on how do we prevent loss from happening? That's where our orientation goes. And when that happens, we're not really thinking about learning from what transpired. And the third one that I want to mention about why don't we learn from failures is what are called heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. So when we learn to negotiate, we develop mental shortcuts about what works, what doesn't, etc. And a lot of the time, those heuristics get in the way because we tend to think that negotiations are similar. Um, and we can use a previous approach and style and tactics that worked in our current negotiation without really thinking about whether that's the right approach or not. Negotiations have some similarities without question, but they also have a lot of differences. And it's very important to understand those two. And actually, part of the reason we get into trouble and we fail is because we're trying to transfer lessons from one negotiation to another when there are dynamics that are really different and actually cause us to run into problems. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. So that's the setup here, and there are 5 steps. Like I think part of the reason why I wanted to put together steps is because as I looked into the literature on negotiation, I didn't see a lot on failure and setbacks and what do you do with these things when they happen. So I thought, one way in which people learn well is to have a bit of a framework to start from, and then they can branch out from there, right? So let me take you through the 5 steps very briefly. Again, I really want to make sure I leave time for comments and questions. But the first step is this idea of failing and accepting it. So in the book, I talk about this because in my estimation and from my point of view, when you don't accept failure, when you try to push it off or blame others, um, you don't really learn from it and you can't really cope with it. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said, "There is no grief like the grief that does not speak." And when we hold back grief, when we hold back disappointment, it sort of clogs us up. I mean, if you think a little bit like a sink, right, that's backed up, nothing gets through. And until you unclog it, you can't get anywhere. And I genuinely believe until you accept your failure, you can't really cope with it. And so what I did was I took a framework originally developed by somebody named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about, and this is called the curve of acceptance. And the curve of acceptance is all about accepting um, bad news. I won't go into great detail here, but the idea is that we all go through when we fail, we experience a series of um, states of emotion, if you will. And typically, you know, people initially feel some form of denial, like this didn't really happen, right? And then maybe they begin to feel anxious because maybe they're realizing it did really happen. And then maybe anger or sadness, depending on your level of frustration and how you handle these kinds of challenges. And then eventually acceptance and sort of recognizing you have a new reality and that you need to solve problems. One of the critiques of this model is that she sort of argued that everybody goes through all these steps. I don't believe that's true. I think some people might go from denial to anxiety to sadness, skipping anger because it's not how they process or how they think, right? But the point is to make this your own and to listen to the conversation in your head about how am I going to accept what's transpired so I can move on to really make sure that I learn from it. Okay. That's the first step. The second step is that we have to analyze what happened, right? And for me, that's a forest and trees analysis. And what I mean by that is that the forest is the big picture, right? We want to go back, for example, to the 7 types of failure and how bad was it, their magnitude, and look at things from that perspective, from a broader point of view, and say, what kind of failure was this? Why did it happen, etc. And then move into the trees. And the trees are what I would call the moves and turns of a negotiation. They're the critical moments that happen during a negotiation where we can pinpoint when things started to go wrong, right? And so it's important for us, if we're going to learn from our setbacks and failures, to do an analysis of what happened. And I have to tell you, I'm really surprised that when I speak to folks about this and they tell me about negotiations that didn't go well, and I ask them, did you analyze what happened and what did you conclude? Most people, their analysis is really cursory. It's really simple and it doesn't get into the kinds of nuances that we need to understand. So, however you analyze it, it's really valuable to step back and say, what happened here and why? And perhaps, you know, learning from it, what could I have done maybe a little bit differently in this instance? Okay. So we've got accepting it so that you can unclog the emotional aspects of failure, which we all experience and they will play a role. And then the second piece is to really look back at the negotiation, analyze the big picture and say, what happened here? What type of failure was this? And can I pinpoint when that failure really started to happen? When, when we ran into a problem and we didn't adjust, or I didn't adjust in a way that might have helped to salvage things. Okay. Mhm. Now, the third step is, in my mind, a really important one because when we fail, we want to learn the lesson, right? So that we can carry that forward into our other negotiations. But the problem is that we often learn the wrong lesson. And if you remember when I talked about heuristics, part of the reason is because of those, that we have a way of negotiating. Most of us have a way to negotiate, and we don't modify it too much to fit the circumstances and things along those lines. And yet we need to. There's a quote in the book from a woman named Catherine Bartol, who's a professor at the University of Maryland. And she said something that really caught my eye, that I partly agree with and partly don't agree with. She said, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. Obviously, what she's getting at is there are really significant differences between negotiations, and that you should treat each negotiation as a standalone kind of event. I think there are lessons that can be learned and transferred from one negotiation to another, but you have to do a really careful analysis and make sure that the dynamics are the same, right? So to me, John Maxwell, a business guru, said experience is not the best teacher, evaluated experiences. And what he's getting at is it's not enough to just say that was a really great or important experience and I learned a lot. He's saying you've got to spend time evaluating that experience and making sure that you're really learning um, the right lesson. And to me, there's a problem that we encounter called transference. Transference comes from psychodynamic therapy and theories, actually. And transference is all about behavior as well as attitudes. So transference happens when we have an experience, um, and we take that experience and we essentially apply it going forward, whether it's warranted or not, whether the dynamics are the same or not. And especially because some of this is rooted in the subconscious. For example, if you learn to negotiate a certain way, how you learn to negotiate is kind of rooted in that subconscious. And if you don't examine that and say, is that the right way to negotiate in this instance? And what I mean by that, for example, is, when the relationship matters and you're going to be negotiating with the same people over time, you have to choose one strategy, right? When the relationship doesn't matter, you're going to use a different one. Like that's just a simple example, right? And so it's really important that we learn the right lessons from our analysis and we say, what are the right lessons? If this negotiation, in a previous negotiation I was in, there was a power asymmetry where the other side had all the power and I had none. And in this negotiation coming up, if I'm thinking about transferring lessons in this negotiation, there isn't that power disparity. We're equal in terms of our power. That's going to impact the lesson and whether we can transfer one thing to another. Okay. All right, a couple more slides. I'll give you a couple more thoughts about the Abraham path, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So after you've thought about learning the right lessons, there's an interesting step in my mind that I think is very important. And I'm asking people to kind of dig deep from a psychological point of view and from a negotiation learning point of view. And that is, I'm asking you to actively unlearn what your weaknesses have taught you. Often, our weaknesses are part of the reason why we failed. So if we're not assertive enough in negotiation, that could be a very big reason why we experienced failure. And so what I'm asking people to do when they think about this and when they make their way through the process is to think about, what do you know? What are the core principles of your approach to negotiation? And are those things helping you or hindering you? So management guru Peter Drucker said, if you want to start doing something new, you have to stop doing something old. And that's part of what I'm wanting to ask people to do is, what you've learned about negotiation, if you step back and say, is this really helping me or not? Um, and if it isn't helping me, what do I do about that? So one of the examples that I use in the book that I'm just going to mention now is viewing compromise as synonymous with negotiation. A lot of people do. And I'm not saying you should never compromise in negotiation, but what I am saying and what I've seen over the course of my career of 30 years is that when people see compromise as synonymous with negotiation, the first thing they do when they run into a problem or a challenge is they start to split the difference, or they start to think about, what do I have to give up in order to reach an agreement? And that way of thinking is very premature, and it actually limits us from finding the best solutions possible. So what I'm advocating and encouraging people to do is replace that concept of compromise with the idea of creative problem solving. That when you run up against a problem or a challenge, instead of trying to split the difference right away, try to dig in and understand what's really going on. Is there a creative solution to the problem in front of you that maybe you don't need to compromise? In William Urie's famous book, Getting to Yes, the book starts with two girls arguing over an orange, and they take a compromised approach, which is they can't reach agreement. So what they do is they decide to cut the orange in half, right? And the first girl, the first sister, takes the orange over to the garbage, peels the orange, throws away the peel, and starts eating the fruit. The second sister then goes over to the garbage, um, peels the peel off, puts that on the counter so she can start making a cake, and throws away the fruit because she was going to use the peel to bake with. That's a compromise solution that didn't need to happen. If they had discussed why they needed the orange, each one would have gotten more, right? So, and again, my experience, particularly with the Abraham path, but in a lot of my negotiations over the years, is that creative problem solving is a much better and a much more useful approach than compromise, right? So that's what I'm asking people to do, is to think about what are these things that underpin your approach to negotiation, and are they really still serving you? Did they potentially aid in your setback or failure? And as you can see with this framework, I'm asking people to do a lot of reflection, a lot of personal reflection, and to turn the mirror on themselves. Okay. Now, the very last step in the process here is to return to the table smarter and stronger. So, what do I mean by that? Well, again, this book is about two things, right? It's about dealing with setbacks. So, with a setback, we can see an opportunity to get back to the table, right? And if that's the case, then we want to start thinking, how do I get back to the table? What did I learn from that first negotiation that's going to help me going forward? Um, I also need to realize that someone's going to have to knock on the door first. And when negotiations don't go well, neither side really wants to do that. But I talk about in the book the instance of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, and when he came out, he reached out to Frederick de Klerk and said, "We need to talk. We need to solve this problem for the good of our country." And a journalist said to him, "Why would you reach out first when you've suffered this way?" And he said, "Someone had to knock on the door first, and I wasn't about to sit around waiting any longer." So if somebody can spend 27 years in prison and come out with that attitude, I think you can probably do something similar with a much less consequences. Right? I also think it's really important to start with them. What is it that they need, etc.? And what did you miss maybe the last time around? And as I said, what went wrong and how do you modify your approach? For example, if you tried to be persuasive using a logical, data-driven approach and it didn't really work, can you focus more on a pathos, emotional way of telling a story or pulling them in that way? Now, if you've really failed and there's no way back to the table, the question becomes, how do you grow from this experience, right? And so the first thing is really go to the balcony, step back, and think about what really transpired and talk to colleagues. I find it very helpful to lay out scenarios like this with my colleagues and ask them for what are their lessons? What were the things that they could see that maybe I can't, right? The second thing is to take the unlearning seriously. Um, to me, there are things we all need to unlearn. And if you can really spend time thinking about it, it's going to help you to genuinely grow as a negotiator. Study the key realms of negotiation and embrace the lessons of kintsugi. So, as I was writing this and thinking about this, the Japanese concept of kintsugi sort of came to mind, and somebody suggested I look at it. And kintsugi actually translates to joining with gold. And the whole concept is a centuries old art that's more than aesthetic. It's actually, for the Japanese, it's part of a broader philosophy of embracing the beauty of human flaws. We all have them, right? And the question is, can we embrace our failures and say, I know these things are going to happen. Um, how do I, learn to live with that and not run away from my failures? It's interesting. I was on a podcast and one of the guys said to me, as I was talking about this, he said, I think what you're doing that's really important is you're decoupling failure from shame. And I think that's right. And I think when you embrace the notion of kintsugi, that's exactly what you're doing is you're wearing your scars openly as opposed to hiding them. Okay. Now, the very last thing I want to mention, then I'm going to stop and hopefully we'll open it up here for a conversation, is um, that there are a few different examples from the Abraham path and where we experienced setbacks or failed, and I just want to mention them. So, one of the places where we had a lot of struggles was with the local teams, not in the sense of what we wanted to do and what they wanted to do, but their approaches to things. So I go back to Turkey when we ended up creating that local committee and wanting to work with folks in that way. We started by saying, okay, so can you please tell us what do you think is the best way for us to, bring the path to life here in Turkey? And the local committee would sort of look at us and say, well, this is your idea, you tell us, or you're from Harvard, you tell us. And at first, I didn't really understand what was going on. And then I had to sort of step back and reflect and consult with some people. And what became clear to me was in that part of Turkey, they still live in what's called a feudal system. And they have chieftains who oversee different areas of the region there. And those chieftains are in charge of everything. And what they do is they essentially tell the folks there, here's what you're going to do, here's what you're not going to do. And so us asking the local committee um, to make these decisions from a cultural point of view didn't fit well. They were confused and it was uncomfortable for them because they always have the chieftain telling them, here's what you're going to do and here's how you're going to do it. And so when we learned that, we realized that we needed to take a different approach and think about the challenge differently. So there was definitely a failure and some learning that transpired there. The second was that when we were working in Jordan, we ran into some political challenges. The name Abraham evokes that, as I mentioned below. And we, had to think creatively in different places. And we brought expertise around mapping and waymarking and things along those lines that the teams on the ground needed. And ultimately, we realized that we needed to let go and have them develop their own path because that's what they wanted and that's what fit well with them. But it was after many instances of failed negotiations and not realizing what was really driving behavior. And as I said, I think the big place where we've had a number of struggles is around the political dimension and the figure of Abraham and Ibrahim and people wanting to claim him for the narrative that goes along with that and to try to manage that tension. It was never a negotiation that we were going to solve or we were going to have a successful conclusion to. The question was always, how do we manage this tension related to all that? So let me stop there and stop sharing so that we can get folks in here to ask their questions, etc. And please let me open up the floor to everybody. So Billie Jean King famously said, failure is feedback. Can you speak to the implications of this to learn the right lesson? Are there teachings you can suggest to detach emotionally that allows equanimity? So really interesting question, David. Um, so I mean, I would definitely agree with her. Um, in terms of the implications, I think the question is, how do there's interestingly enough, a lot of books that are out there about giving feedback, right? And that oftentimes people don't do it very well. And so part of it is the question of how do people really learn, really take in the lesson, really take in the feedback. And there's actually a really interesting book called Thanks for the Feedback by my colleagues Sheila Heen and Doug Stone. And I think it's a really good one, in terms of techniques to learn to take in feedback when it's coming at you and it may be a bit difficult and challenging. On the emotional, the techniques to detach emotionality. So one technique that Yuri talked about in his book, Getting Past No, is the idea of going to the balcony. And that was a concept that was originally discussed in a book by a guy named Ron Heifetz called Leadership on the Line. And the idea there is when we feel like our emotions are overwhelming us, we temporarily step back to sort of manage our emotions effectively. Um, it's certainly difficult when the stakes are high to do that. But I will say, to me, emotions are always going to play a role. And there's a great book also called Beyond Reason by some of my colleagues, Roger Fisher and Dan Shapiro, that talks very much about the emotional dimension of negotiation and how it needs to be viewed as fuel for progress, not necessarily something to be avoided. And frankly, what they say in the book is when you suppress your emotions, you're going to run into problems. When you learn to manage them from an emotionally intelligent point of view, you're going to be much better off, and much more centered in your approach to things. But great question. Thank you, David. Another David Lesh. David, how are you, my friend? Do you talk about the role of empathy in negotiations in your book? College admissions looking at high school athletes in a more favorable way because failures at the core of sports and athletes are typically more resilient and can weather the ups and downs of college better. So I do talk about empathy. I think it's important, especially, toward the end of the book where I talk about the importance of, um, even though you may disagree and you may really struggle with the person in the negotiation where you experience that setback and failure, the idea of understanding where they're coming from and trying to figure out what they need, to get out of this because you had a first attempt and it didn't go very well. And so you've got to think differently and more nuanced. I think it's interesting to me, people throw the term empathy around a lot. And it's a lot harder than it really appears to be, to really put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But to me, I mean, that's such an important dimension of negotiation. There was a famous article written a number of years ago by a guy named Robert Mnookin at Harvard Law School and a couple other guys, Scott Peppett and Drew Tulamello, called The Three Tensions in Negotiation. And one of the tensions that they highlight is this tension between empathy and assertiveness. And I really think to be an effective negotiator, you need both. You've got to be able to empathize and really put yourself in the shoes of the other person that you're negotiating with and to be assertive. And they're not mutually exclusive. To me, being able to empathize only helps me more to really realize why I need to be assertive because they need to get what they need to get out of this process, and so do I. So yeah, I do. There's always more room for talking about empathy, but there's definitely some in there about how to do that, and especially after you've experienced the setback and failure, and you're coping with that emotional piece of it. So Oliver, while working on this book, what is the learning that touched you inside, and how did it touch you, if I may? Uh, yeah. So, I think there's a couple of things. I think the one thing that really touched me personally was this whole idea of unlearning certain things. Um, it's really not an easy thing to do, and I realize that I'm asking people to dig pretty deep and to look, um, very carefully at their uh, view on negotiation and how it evolved and why do they think these things. If I go back to the idea of compromise, when I ask people, why do you think that in my trainings or whatever, advising or coaching, why do you think that about compromise? Most people can't really tell me. They don't have a good reason. They just learned it and it's become in sort of ingrained behavior. And so I think getting ourselves to really look inward and, do a bit of an analysis of what are those things that we think are really helping us and are they, was really, really powerful for me. And I had to do it on my own as well in terms of understanding the things that did that. I will also say that, I dedicated the book to my dad, and my dad and I had a somewhat typical father-son relationship for a very long time. And it was only at the end of his life where we kind of came around full circle. And, um, that kind of failure, if you will, taught me to stick with things. And I refused to give up on our relationship. And eventually he sort of came around to that. And so in many ways, that was also a personal thing for me that, and in the book, to start the book, I tell people I experienced a lot of failure as a kid. I was a pretty average child. There was nothing spectacular about me in any way, shape, or form. And in some ways, I genuinely think that helped me, because I learned to fail as a young kid. And eventually I realized that, you know what, like this isn't the end of the world. I can get up and dust myself off and think about what to do now. And so I've seen a lot of people who don't have that orientation, who are perhaps really, really great students, or things came easy to them. And then later in life, they struggled and they didn't have that resiliency, and I can't emphasize that enough that Chris mentioned early on that, being resilient in this realm is fundamentally important because much of the time things don't go the way you imagine. They don't unfold in that way. And so you have to adapt and adjust and keep trying to find a way through a really difficult problem. So, Martin, let's see, you're talking about failures of the negotiators as if all negotiations would succeed if no mistakes were made, but aren't some situations simply impossible to solve in a certain moment? So let me pause there and say, yes, they are. And that's where that's why I use the terminology of failure. And it was interesting, by the way, when I started to shop this book around, I went to three publishers, the one that previously published my book, and then two others. And they said, this is a really interesting idea, but we don't publish about failure. People don't want to read about failure. And they were like, well, and I said, well, okay, but like people do fail. So why are we so afraid of that? And I will say one of the interesting things in one of the conversations was with Harvard Business Press. And as I talked to an individual there, he said, I know this is going to be problematic for my editors and things like that, but he said, I will candidly tell you that, Harvard Business Review puts out a magazine every year or every month, monthly or quarterly. And he said the best-selling magazine we ever had was during COVID, where the word failure was right across the cover, about all of the things that we could have done differently. And so ultimately, with the publisher that I found who was interested in this, they said, look, we really want to publish this. The one thing that they said to me, and it was still a little disappointing, but I had to go with it, was we don't think it's best to use failure in the title, because it will push some people away. And so I had to go from there, to, something along those lines. Sorry about that. Anyways, but thinking from anything from big wars to personal situations, whenever the balance is at a certain time very uneven, one side doesn't need to negotiate. Agreed, Martin. And so I do think that um, failure is part of the deal here. And one realm where I see this a lot is in peace processes, in large uh, conflicts where people are trying to negotiate a solution. There's lots of processes that fail, that ultimately lead to one that succeeds. If you think about South Africa, or Northern Ireland, or Mozambique, or Colombia, you name it, right? And so failure is absolutely part of the deal. And I think it's important to call it failure when it really is. When you can't see a way back to the table, at least in the near term, you have to chalk that up as a failure. You want to keep the door open, you want to keep trying, maybe into the future, but it's definitely possible, especially when relationships gets damaged that you need. Okay, a couple more here. So Kevin asked, have you come across a situation where those who come to negotiation are not honest, but it's more of a show than really seeking solution? What happens in such case? Yeah, I would say absolutely. There are times when people come and they're not negotiating in good faith. And when that happens, it's very hard to make any kind of progress because people are using the process itself in a manipulative kind of manner. And I think the more negotiating you do, the more you can begin to sort of sniff that out and realize, and you can test the other side. That's often what I do when I'm a little concerned about how they're approaching things. I'll try to test them a bit with small things. And if they're unwilling to commit, or if they're, avoiding the challenge I put in front of them, that tells me that maybe this is more of a show than real. Janie, I volunteer with an organization based on Benedictine spirituality, listening with the ear of the heart. Oh, I love that. Pages 112, 113. People's minds are more alert during times of uncertainty. Made me think of this teaching. Do you think we are better at listening when we are faced with uncertainty? So it's a great question. And by the way, I mention in the book another book. So I had the pleasure of interviewing a woman named Maggie Jackson, who wrote a book called Uncertain. And the whole idea with that book is that she's trying to get people to understand the power of sitting with uncertainty. Most of us have the mindset, tell me yes, tell me no, but tell me something, right? That they don't want uncertainty. They want some form of certainty. And so, and in her book, she talks about if you can learn to sit with uncertainty, people's minds are actually open to the most creativity and the most creative solutions if you can learn to do that. I think the problem is that most people have the mindset I mentioned of tell me yes, tell me no, but tell me something. And they find being sitting with uncertainty very uncomfortable. So it's very hard to listen when you feel uncomfortable, right? You're not taking things in. So I think you have to go to the source and say, how do I, and maybe this is a little bit of unlearning, right? Why do I see uncertainty in this way? Why do I find it so uncomfortable? One of the things that I do a lot with my students or in the trainings I do is I explain to them that in negotiation, we always work with incomplete information. And as a result, we have to learn to adapt and we have to learn to sit with uncertainty. And so, as Chris mentioned, I've included a number of exercises in the back of the book from a colleague of mine named Izzy Gazelle, who used to teach, sadly, he passed away last month, but he taught improv and the skills of improv to leaders and negotiators and people who deal with conflict. And some of those exercises help people to live in the moment, which is what improv is all about, but also to live with uncertainty, to live with adaptability and becoming flexible. So I think the key is to learn to do that. Um, and then you're going to be better at listening because you're going to be a little more centered, a little more capable of taking in what people are telling you. Great questions, really terrific. And I see we're pretty much at our witching hour. So Chris, let me perhaps flip this back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. First, I want to thank all of you for being here, and especially to you, Josh. It was a really wonderful conversation on a topic that isn't really talked about a lot. And creating a space like this for humility opens up a world of possibilities. And I hope everyone will walk away sort of renewed in your abilities to revive whatever conflicts, both internal or external, that you may be carrying in your heads or your hearts. I also want to mention to all of you that it's webinars like these and the knowledge we're able to bring from the amazing people in our API network, like Josh, that we are excited to share with our members. We have even more exciting events coming up, and we're really looking forward to announcing them in short order. I also want to appreciate everyone who's a member and the support that your donations let us put on to create events like these. For those of you who haven't donated yet this year, I want to remind you that memberships will renew in October. And to continue enjoying events like this, like webinars and our newsletter, and of course, the great recipes that many of you have tried that are in there, it requires a donation of literally just any amount at all. We want to make events like these open to everybody, regardless of financial need. And membership renews in October for those who haven't donated yet this year. So thank you so much. And especially thank you, Josh.
My pleasure.